Hi everyone, this is Sporty History. Welcome back. Today I'm going to be covering the creation of the Commonwealth Games. So I'm going to cover what they are, how they came to be, what happens in them, and how they're different from regular events like the Olympics or World Championships. So I'm going to start with a little bit of information and history about what the Commonwealth actually is. So what is the Commonwealth? Basically, the Commonwealth is a group of countries with a shared language, history, and kind of perception and values of the world that all comes from colonialism. Basically, being colonized by Britain at some point or being put into its empire at some point throughout history is a qualification for being part of the Commonwealth. Now, the British Empire at one point was one of the largest and most powerful empires in the world, and today consists of about 2.5 billion people. So for perspective, 1 out of every 3 persons in the world is in a Commonwealth nation. There are currently 54 Commonwealth states, which include places like India, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, many different islands in the Caribbean, South Africa, and Britain. Now, the head of the organization is Queen Elizabeth II currently. However, whoever is head of the British monarchy or is crowned king or queen becomes then the head of the Commonwealth. So when Prince Charles assumes the throne, whenever Queen Elizabeth is no longer on it, he will become the head of the Commonwealth, and so on and so forth. Within the Commonwealth, they have a charter known as the Charter of the Commonwealth, which kind of has some attributes that each country strives to attain and maintain, basically. So this includes things like good governments, rule of law, democracy, equality, and human rights. So the organization currently focuses on non-governmental relationships between a lot of these different member states. So there aren't any specific Commonwealth benefits per se of being part of the Commonwealth or being a member state. So there's not an extra bonus on trade or economic ties. Well, there's not necessarily supposed to be, but because a lot of these countries have a kind of shared culture, values, language, a lot of trade and economic stuff kind of coincides with that. So like as an example, a lot of kind of British Empire states like Canada and Australia have fairly good political, governmental, and economic relationships. But that doesn't mean if you're not part of the Commonwealth that you can't have good relationships with those countries. So with some information about the Commonwealth and what it is exactly, I'm going to start with a little bit of history of the games and how they actually came to be. So in 1891, a gentleman by the name of John Astley Cooper thought it would be a good idea to have some sort of gathering of people who were in the empire or former members of it. The idea was to have a pan-Britannic, pan-Anglican contest and festival about every 4 years as a means of increasing goodwill and good understanding within the British Empire. Essentially, what he wanted to do is have all member states or former members of the British Empire come together every 4 years for a festival or events or some sort, which ended up being a little bit of sports and a little bit of other cultural festival events as well. Eventually, committees with this purpose of having this inter-empire association started popping up in different countries. And they started creating different events and different kind of relationships at this time, which were economical and political, kind of governmental, just to kind of link these countries together in a way because of their shared history. So later in 1911, King George V of the United Kingdom was crowned, and to honor him, they held a massive festival in London called the Festival of the Empire. Now, this was a little bit of everything. It was a little bit of kind of World's Fair. It was a little bit of a government political one to kind of celebrate the new head of the empire or the Commonwealth. But there were lots of different little events that were being held, but one of them was called the Inter-Empire Championships. Now, what this was different Commonwealth countries came together and competed in some athletic events, which included boxing, wrestling, swimming, and athletics. Now, the countries that came together to join this event were Canada, the UK, South Africa, and Australasia, which was basically a combination of New Zealand and Australia. Now, there were a number of critics of the event saying that it wasn't big enough to be a representation of the empire, it wasn't grand enough, because at one point, Britain did basically have 1 out of every 3 people in the entire world as part of their little empire tucked away. However, even with the critics aside, they were still very popular with those who competed and those who watched them as well. So there was not an official Commonwealth Sports Games until 1930, when the British Empire Games were held, and this is considered the first Commonwealth Games. Now I'm going to go over some of the Commonwealth Games throughout history so you can see how they kind of developed into the Commonwealth Games that you may or may not know today. So I'm going to start off with the 1930 British Empire Games. They were held in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. There were 11 nations who competed: Scotland, Wales, South Africa, Northern Ireland, England, Bermuda, Australia, British Guiana, New Zealand, and Newfoundland. Yes, the province of Newfoundland competed as its own individual nation. At this time, it wasn't actually a province of Canada. That wouldn't happen until about 1949. It was still technically under British rule, but was kind of more like a little territory than actually part of British rule. So it was able to have a little bit of its own independence, but wasn't fully independent. Now, sports included wrestling, boxing, swimming, rowing, athletics, lawn bowling, and diving. A Canadian by the name of George Smallacombe became the first ever British Empire champion in the sport of athletics. Now, these games were fairly successful and were liked by the participants and the citizens, so they decided to do them again, and similar to the Olympics, decided to set them every 4 years. Now on to the 1934 British Empire Games. Now these games were held in London. Originally they were supposed to be held in South Africa, but were removed from South Africa due to concerns that there would be prejudice and racism against Asians and Black athletes from different Commonwealth nations. Because at this time South Africa was starting to kind of implement some apartheid laws that would have maybe affected a lot of Commonwealth citizens from, example, the Caribbean and particularly India from actually coming and traveling to the country. So to avoid having any of those issues, they moved the games to London instead of maybe looking at what the real root of the issue was that South Africa had apartheid policies that didn't really fit in with what the Commonwealth represented or what it was. Now, also at this Games, the Free Irish State took part, which was the first and only time it ever took part in the Commonwealth Games or most other Commonwealth activities. This was because of the not so great history between Ireland and England at this time, and they later removed themselves from the Commonwealth, thus removing themselves from the Games. So now on to the 1950 British Empire Games. They were originally set for Montreal, however, but due to the Second World War, they were cancelled and later moved to Auckland, New Zealand. Now at the opening ceremony, there were 40,000 people in attendance, and over 250,000 people did come to watch some of the sports. Also to note, at this Games, this was one of the first big major sporting events for the Commonwealth after the Second World War. Now during the Second World War, many, if not almost all of the Commonwealth nations or former empire nations like Canada and Australia all fought together during the Second World War. So this was the first time they all came together to kind of represent themselves without there having to be a war. Now to the 1954 British Empire and Commonwealth Games. Now they added the Commonwealth in there because by this point there was a number of countries that weren't really part of the empire anymore, but that were still competing. So these games were held in Vancouver, British Columbia, and were also very successful, just like the Vancouver 2010 Olympic Games. Now at this Commonwealth Games, they had what was called the Miracle Mile, which saw the first 4 sub-minute mile. Now England's Roger Bannister and Australia's John Landley raced on live television almost shoulder to shoulder the entire way. Bannister would win, just edging out Landy, and would set a new world record and set a new precedent for how fast a mile could be run. Also at this Games, Emmanuel Ifeanyi of Nigeria became the first Black African to win a gold medal at the Commonwealth Games in the high jump. At the 1958 British Empire and Commonwealth Games held in Cardiff, Wales, the Queen's Baton Relay was introduced. The baton starts from Buckingham Palace, travels to the majority, if not all, of the Commonwealth nations, and makes it to the location of which that Games will start for the opening ceremonies. Since then, it's been a part of the Commonwealth Games. Now, at the 1966 British Empire and Commonwealth Games that were held in Kingston, Jamaica, this was a kind of a big event because at this time, it was the first Commonwealth Games to be held in a predominantly Black nation, as previous games were held in places like Canada, Australia, the UK, and New Zealand, which were predominantly white nations. And it was one of the first times a sporting event like this was held in the Caribbean. Now, at the 1970 British Commonwealth Games, they kind of dropped the empire as it was a little bit taboo at this point. Britain wasn't really much of an empire anymore either. Now, these games were held in Edinburgh, Scotland. This was also the first time that the Queen officially attended the games as the head of the Commonwealth, which is weird considering that at this point it had been held for almost 40 years and had been held in the UK multiple times. I guess maybe she was just really not a fan of showing up to the event. Now, at the 1974 British Commonwealth Games that were held in Christchurch, New Zealand, the games became known as the Friendly Games for an unfortunate reason. So this event was a bit different and had a bit more of a different atmosphere. Now, at the 1972 Olympics in Munich, Germany, an event called the Munich Massacre occurred where a Palestinian-backed terrorist group killed 11 Israeli Olympic athletes and coaches. Now, this 1974 Games was the first kind of big inter-country, multiple country sporting event that would happen after the Munich Massacre in 1972. So a lot of people kind of turned into watching these Commonwealth Games to see how an event like this would happen from now on, whether security was updated, other things were changed in protection of the athletes. So the Commonwealth really kind of focused on calling this the Friendly Games, and from this Commonwealth Games kind of started structures for how security and issues like this are dealt with big international sporting events. Now, the 1978 Commonwealth Games were held in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. They finally dropped a lot of the empire or the empire language from the Commonwealth Games and the British kind of colonial language because at this point, really, most people were no longer in an empire. They were more just kind of post-Commonwealth states. Now, at this event, there were a couple of boycotts due to kind of some inter-Commonwealth political disputes. Unlike the Olympic Games, there's a lot less people involved, for one, and there's a lot less different kind of nations with different values involved. There doesn't really tend to be a lot of boycotts at the Commonwealth Games because they kind of have a bit more shared kind of values or rules or governments and whatnot. Now, at the 1986 Commonwealth Games held again in Edinburgh, Scotland, there wasn't that many countries that actually showed up. Now, the lovely, and I say that with a huge amount of sarcasm, Margaret Thatcher made a lot of people angry, as she often did, by allowing Britain to continue to support South Africa even though it was in the midst of apartheid. And by this time, a lot of information was coming out internationally, kind of letting people know how bad it was in South Africa during apartheid and how really no one should really be supporting them at this time. So 32 countries from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean withdrew from the games. Normally about 50 to 60 countries compete at games every year around this time, so about half of the nations that normally showed up didn't, which made for slim pickings for a lot of events. Now, the 1994 Commonwealth Games were held in Victoria, British Columbia, and it was the first time that South Africa was allowed to compete at the Games since 1958 due to the fall of apartheid earlier that year. Now, at the 1998 Commonwealth Games that were held in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, was a bit of a big deal. It was the first time the games were held in an Asian country, and it was one of the first times that the games included team sports. Now, the 2010 Commonwealth Games were held in Delhi, India. At this time, it was the largest Commonwealth Games to date, with 71 nations competing with over 4,300 athletes. And it was the second time that the games were held in Asia and were noted as being very, very successful. At the 2018 Commonwealth Games that were held in Gold Coast, Australia, it became the first ever multi-sport event to have equal events along gender lines. So there was the same amount of gold, silver, and bronze medals going to women and to men. Now, not necessarily within the same events, however, there were some women-only and men-only sports, but they made sure that enough championships and gold medals were going equally to men and women. So the Commonwealth Games of 2022 are set to be held in Birmingham, England. Now I'm just going to quickly kind of reiterate and talk a little bit more in detail about what makes the Commonwealth Games different from the Olympics or other World Championship events. So I'm going to go over 3 different kind of main categories as to why it's different. So the first one is the selective entry requirements. Now, you had to have been a British colony or part of the empire at one point basically in your country's history in order to qualify as being part of the Commonwealth and thus the Commonwealth Games. There are a couple countries that have withdrawn their status from the Commonwealth and thus can no longer compete in the Commonwealth Games. Now, for example, a country like the US, which was at one point part of the British Empire, now because they didn't have a very nice, it was a little bit messy breakup, which included basically a revolution and a war, they're not considered part of the Commonwealth, but countries, let's say for Canada, as an example, who kind of parted ways nicely, they're considered a Commonwealth country. Now, within the UK, there are separate nations that can compete as themselves, like Wales, Northern Ireland, England, and Scotland, as opposed to a unit like Great Britain or the United Kingdom in bigger international events. And that's because within the United Kingdom, those countries are kind of seen as different nations, but they kind of all come together to form the United Kingdom, hence the name. So another thing to consider is with those selective entry requirements that the big 3 are not a part of the game. So I'm talking the US, China, and Russia. Now these big 3 tend to take a lot of medals in World Championship and Olympic events. So with smaller nations who really can't compete with the level of funding and the kind of level of performance that the US, Russia, or China has, like smaller Caribbean islands or smaller islands in Asia, or even just like the nation of Northern Ireland, for example, get a bit more of a chance to shine at the Commonwealth Games and actually compete and, you know, kind of rank a little bit higher. And with that, the Commonwealth Games is actually an opportunity for smaller nations and other nations that maybe don't have that kind of big 3 status to create new world records and also to qualify for events like the Olympics and World Championship events. So the second one is more specifically events that are held at the Commonwealth Games. Now, athletes with disabilities or para-athletes are included in the whole nation's team. Each country will bring non-disabled and para-athletes to the games as a whole unit and represent themselves as a whole unit during the games. So different para events include para-athletics, para-lawn bowls, para-swimming, para-table tennis, and wheelchair basketball, and also para-cycling as well. So even during when the nations are marching in, all athletes, not disabled, and para-athletes are all walking in at the same time. Now, they did initially have a separate para-Commonwealth Games. However, they decided to just kind of bring everything all together all in one so that they could have a joint games. Now, also some of the events are different as well. These events don't tend to be as popular outside of the Commonwealth and are not played at other events like the Olympics or World Championships. And they include women's netball, cricket, squash, and lawn bowling. About that much. Now, they did hold a Winter Commonwealth Games. However, it stopped in 1966 as many Commonwealth countries don't really participate or don't really have access to being able to compete in winter sports. When you think of some Commonwealth countries, the only one that really comes to mind that has winter, or at least a longer winter, is Canada. I think that's about it. You might get like a Jamaican bobsleigh team in there, but most of the Commonwealth is kind of situated in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. So there's not really a whole lot of winter sports activities happening there. Now, the final one is going to be on inclusion and equality. As I mentioned, para-athletes are included into the games and represented with the rest of the nation, as in non-disabled athletes. So they come in together as a unit as opposed to being separate, so that, you know, para-athletes will get coverage throughout the games, just like non-disabled athletes as well. It's also the first multi-sport event that has the same number of men's and women's gold medals that are handed out at each games, like I mentioned earlier. It's only recent, but it is very important, as there is a fair bit of disparity between how many medals are given out to men's and men's team athletics versus women's and women's teams athletics. Now, as I said, they are in different sports, like there is a men's handball versus a women's netball, but they make sure that they're handing out the same amount of gold medals to women and the same amount of gold medals out to men. So that is the history, well, not the full history, a little bit of a rundown of what the Commonwealth Games are, how they're different, and how they actually came to be. So if you enjoyed this, you can always like, or if you want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe, or also let me know if there's another sport history video you'd like me to cover, because I know everyone's probably indoors right now with not much else to do. Thank you for watching. Have a good rest of your day, and bye.